Welcome back to the introduction to Microsoft Excel. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at actually navigating around in the spreadsheet and doing some very basic formula construction. So for this one, you will be following along using Microsoft Excel on your own, side by side. As I step through the process, you will also go through the process and follow along with the directions. So before we do that, I want to just quickly review a couple of just key items from the prior discussion, just to make sure that we're on the same page, and also as a reminder as we go into Excel. So we'll start off with cell contents. So in the last lecture, I discussed what the three types of things are that can be placed into a cell. And I essentially said that there are three things. There are labels, numbers, and formulas. Labels, as I mentioned, are words. They're letters, numbers, words, anything that's descriptive that just describes something else on the spreadsheet. In this example here, we can see the words Girl Scout cookie sales up in cell A1. And in that case, this would function as the title for our spreadsheet. But again, labels can be anything that describes something on the spreadsheet. You can put anything you want into a label. Next, we have numbers. And numbers are essentially just what they sound like. They're just mathematical values, or something that you can do something mathematical to. So in this case, we have two numbers. We have a 10 and a 5. And these are functioning as input values, which will be used in a formula to produce some sort of a calculation. And then finally, we have formulas. And in this particular example, the formula will go in cell C6. And formulas in Excel can be mathematical in nature, or they can be totally non-mathematical. They can do all kinds of things. They can manipulate words and letters. They can manipulate dates. They can execute logic trees. They can do lots and lots of different things, not necessarily involving numbers or mathematical operations of some sort. So again, very quick review here of some of the guidelines for creating formulas. Because the idea in Excel is that numbers represent variables. In other words, what we want to do is we want to use that input-output model that we discussed several weeks ago when we talked about legal issues. And the idea there is that computers are input-output devices. We put data into a computer. The software tells the computer what to do to the data, and then it produces some sort of output, which is that data that has been processed. So in this particular case, the inputs are the 10 and the 5, the number of boxes sold and the price per box. The software is essentially going to be the formula that processes that data. And when it executes, it's going to produce the output for us. So we're actually going to create the software ourselves in this particular case. Now, because the inputs are inputs, they're designed to be modified. These are cells that are designed to have different values plugged into them, versus the labels. Those aren't designed to be changed. Those are designed to always stay the same. We need some way to visually make them look different than the rest of the spreadsheet, so that somebody using the spreadsheet looks at it and says, oh, okay, I understand. This is where I put the data into. The way we do that is historically with a blue font. So the blue font indicates that these are input cells, and it's okay to enter different values into them, as opposed to the formula. If someone enters something over the formula, they will destroy the formula. So the idea is that the formula always has to stay in place. So we would make that a black font, just like the labels, and that indicates that, no, this isn't designed to be changed. This is permanent. Now, there are ways to technologically make sure that nobody changes things by locking and protecting cells, and we'll talk about that down the line a little bit. But for right now, the important thing to remember is that when you're designing the spreadsheet, input cells should be indicated with a blue font, and we'll talk about how to do that here very shortly. The formulas in Excel are essentially the same formula logic you would imagine the important thing here is that not that we're multiplying 10 times 5. The important thing is that we're multiplying the number of boxes sold times the price. It's the logic that's important, not the numbers. The numbers are really secondary because they can change. So our formula here really has to say, okay, take the number of boxes sold and multiply it by the price. Whatever those boxes are, how many there are, whatever that price is, take those two things, multiply them together, and we'll always get the correct profit number. So in this case, we know that the number of boxes sold will appear in cell C3. That's where it's been entered. The price appears in cell C4. So our formula multiplies C3 times C4. We're just using the cell addresses in place of the actual numbers. So that brings us to our first really big rule, which is we never, ever, ever should be using numbers inside of formulas. It should always be cell addresses instead of numbers. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but they're usually kind of rare. For example, if I was going to, if I had a number for the total sales over the course of the year and I wanted to calculate the average per day, well, I would divide that by 365. So that formula would include a number, 365. And that's okay because there's always 365 days to a year. So there are some situations where you can use a number in a formula, but only when they're static or constant numbers that aren't expected to ever change. Other two rules. First of all, you always next of all, you always start a formula with an equal sign. So the very first thing that goes into that cell should always be an equal sign. That's what tells Excel that you're about to create a formula. And then finally, once you're done with the formula, there's exactly one thing you should do 100% of the time, and that is hit the Enter key. The Enter key will save the formula to the cell. If you do anything other than hitting the Enter key, you risk losing or changing the formula inappropriately. So once you're done with the formula, hit the Enter key. Don't click anywhere, don't get fancy and do anything else. Just hit the Enter key, and then you can go on to something else. Once you start Microsoft Excel, the next step is going to be to go ahead and select a blank workbook as the place you want to go. So we're going to create a blank workbook. And now, as a reminder from last week, workbooks are collections of worksheets. And when you create a workbook, it creates one worksheet by default, and we can see that notated down here in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen where you see this tab saying Sheet 1. We can rename a worksheet by right-clicking and selecting Rename. And we'll call this our test worksheet. Hit Enter when you're done, and we now have renamed our worksheet. The plus sign to the right allows us to add a new sheet to the workbook. And as we go along, we will be adding new sheets to this book and renaming them accordingly. Navigation inside of Microsoft Excel is pretty straightforward. Mouse click will get you to pretty much any cell that you'd like to go to directly. Selecting a cell is just really a mouse click. If you'd like to select multiple cells, this is just sort of a click and drag type of operation. Now, I want to make a point here, and this is an extremely important one in Excel, probably one of the most important ones, that if you don't pay attention to, it will trip you up in the future. Just 100% guarantee of that. And it is the fact that in Excel, the shape of the cursor is critically important. You always have to pay attention to it because it will change as you do different operations. And the shape of the cursor will give you an indication as to what's going to happen when you click the mouse button. Right now, you'll notice that the shape of my cursor is this big fat plus sign. That's the technical term we use for it, big fat plus sign. And the big fat plus sign essentially means that if you click, you're going to be selecting cells. If I click one time, I will select a single cell. If I click and I start dragging around, I will select a range of cells. Incidentally, when we have a range of cells, there's a name for that. The name or the identifier is based on the starting point of the cell and the ending point. So in this case, B3 to E7 would be the selected range here, because my first cell is B3. And by the way, notice that the B3 is white. It's not highlighted like the other cells are. And that's to tell us that that is the starting point. And the ending point here is in B7. So back to the cursor shapes. A big fat plus sign means you can select cells. Now, I'll give you some examples of other types of cursor symbols that you'll see. I'm just going to put some random junk into the cell and select it by clicking on it with my big fat plus sign. Now notice that if I take my cursor and I put it around the edge border here of this cell, it changes shape. It changes from the big fat plus sign to kind of like a little crossed arrow looking thingy. So it's like a four-way crossed arrow thingy. That is the move icon. If I click at this point and start dragging around, I won't be selecting cells. I will be moving that cell to another location. I'll click my undo to undo that and bring it back where it was. But this is really important. I can't tell you how many times I'll see someone do this. They'll go to select a bunch of cells but not pay attention to the cursor. And instead of starting with the big fat plus sign and selecting cells like that, what they're doing is they start with the crossed arrow thingy, click, and then they end up just moving the cell rather than selecting it. So really important you pay attention to those two. Those are two that are very commonly confused. And if you're doing this quickly and you're not paying attention, it's very easy to take your cell and move it somewhere where it doesn't belong, possibly overwriting something that was in that destination cell. So again, you want to pay attention to what you're doing, otherwise you can really kind of mess up your spreadsheet. So those are our two cursor symbols. Now I'll throw in a few more here. If I take my cursor and I put it directly over the column header B, notice that it changes shape once again. Now it looks like a little tiny down arrow. That essentially is an indicator that if I click, what I'm doing is I'm selecting the entire column. So now I have selected everything from cell B1 all the way down to cell B1,048,576. I've selected the entire column. If I take my cursor and I put it over one of the row headers and click, notice the symbol once again changes. Now it looks like a little right arrow, and clicking that one will select the entire row. So now every single column in that row is now selected. Incidentally, when you do that, if you want to further select more rows, you can just drag up and down, starting with that little right arrow. Same thing with the columns. I can click on a column, hold the button, drag right and left, and I can select multiple columns that way. This is really handy if you know that everything that's going to go in column B maybe needs to be formatted as currency. I can select that with one mouse click, come over here to my format, and select the currency format, and then that would select the entire column, so I don't have to do those cells individually or in ranges. Okay, so those are two more symbol cursor shapes. Now we're going to go ahead and create our little Girl Scout cookie model, and in doing so we'll experiment with a few techniques here. So to do this, let's start by adding another sheet to our workbook. So we're going to come down here to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. You'll see that little plus sign in the little round circle there to the right of the tab. Go ahead and click that. It'll automatically create sheet 2 for you. Now I'm going to zoom in to make this larger so it's easier to see on the video. Notice if you'd like to zoom in and out on the right side of the screen there near the bottom, there's a zoom control that you can use to magnify or make it smaller so you can fit more stuff in, kind of depending on what your needs are. Now I'm actually doing it using a shortcut, which is the control key and the scroll wheel on the mouse. if you hold down the control key and you use the scroll wheel on the mouse, you can zoom in and out. It's exactly the same as using that little zoom in control. Now, for our little model here, we're going to go ahead and duplicate essentially what we had in the PowerPoint slide. So in cell A1, we're going to go ahead and create our label, which will be Girl Scout cookie sales. Now, anytime you type anything into a cell, very important that you always hit the enter key at the end. Don't click anywhere else. Don't take any shortcuts. Hit the enter key. 100% of the time, you should always hit that enter key when you're done with the contents of a cell. Now, notice that when we do this, the label Girl Scout cookie sales exceeds the width of the column. Now, if I click on cell A1, my formula bar up at the top of the screen here shows the contents of that cell, and the contents are the words Girl Scout cookie sales. The entire label is contained in cell A1. Even though part of it looks like it's in column B and even in C, it's not. If I click on B1 and I look up here on my formula bar, there's nothing in there. Same thing with C. The entire label is contained in cell A1. The problem is that the column is not wide enough to hold it. Now, this may or may not be a problem. In this case, it's probably not a problem unless I were to come along and try to put something into column B. Because now if I put something in column B, what happens is that you can no longer see that excess stuff in column A. It gets overwhelmed here by the stuff in B. If I delete what is in B, selected, and I hit the delete key, I get my stuff back in A. So it's just being obscured. It's not getting deleted, it's just being obscured. So generally, it's a good practice to try to always accommodate the full label wherever it is that you put it. So in this particular case, there are two things we could do. We could either widen column A to make it wide enough to hold that, or we could actually take these three cells and collapse them into a single cell. And this is the merge and center command up on the keyboard, or on the toolbar, excuse me. So if we go up here under the Home tab on the ribbon bar, you'll see there's this button that says Merge and Center. I'm going to start by selecting A1, B1, and C1. I'll click my Merge and Center button, and now what it's done is it's essentially merged them into a single cell called A1. But now it's just a single cell, which means that I don't have to worry about putting stuff next to it that's going to obscure it. So this is one way to deal with cells that are too wide. We could have widened column A, and the way we widen a column is by taking the cursor, putting it directly between the two columns, but I'm doing it up here between the actual letters. I'm not doing it down here in the spreadsheet. I'm doing it up on the header. And when I do that, you'll see that once again the cursor changes shape. Now it becomes this little crossed arrow thing. It's like a two-way crossed arrow thing. At this point, I can either click and stretch my column. So I've now made the entire column wide enough to hold it, or there's a shortcut for this. I could put my cursor directly on that same spot and just double click on it. And when I do that, that's called the auto sizer. It sizes everything in that column to be just the right size. So it makes the column just big enough to hold whatever the biggest thing is that is in it. So either of these techniques will work. They're going to give a little different appearance to the spreadsheet. So in this case, everything is going to get moved over to the right because I made the entire column wider as opposed to the merge and center. So for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and undo this, and I'm going to go back to the merge and center. So for your purposes, what I recommend is if you If you were clicking around there and resizing and doing some of the things that I was doing, go ahead and hit the undo a few times. Get back to the original spreadsheet the way it looked. Select A1 through C1 and click your merge and center. Okay, and you now should have everything neatly merged and centered. So it merged the three together and it centered the words inside of column B. Now I'm going to drop down and I'm going to start creating my other labels. And I'm going to change this just a little bit from what was in the PowerPoint. Boxes sold. We'll go into column B3. And then price per box will go into B4. Now, notice that again, we have the situation where the labels are a little too big for the columns that they're in. Now, in this case, merge and center is not necessarily our best tool. In this particular case, resizing the column will probably work better because we need to make sure everything in that column is going to fit. So for this one, I'm going to go to this dividing line here between B and C. So you're going to place your cursor directly over that dividing line, just like I have. Look at your cursor, make sure it looks like my cursor. So it should look like that little two-way crossed arrow thingy. And at this point, you can either click and stretch, or you can just double click. Either method will work fine. And once you do that, everything should now neatly fit into column B. And that would be the number of boxes sold and the price per box. Now, dropping down a little bit, I'm going to go down to B6, and this is where I'm going to put the label for my result. And we'll call this Cookie Profits. I generally, when I create any sort of a model, I like to start off by laying out the labels and figuring out what the model is going to visually look like. Excel is kind of a blank slate. You can do anything you want with it. It's not going to prevent you from creating a layout that's dumb. It has no way of knowing. All it knows is that it does what you tell it to. So it's up to us to try to create layouts that are going to work best, that are going to be intuitive. And this design aspect is very, very important. My recommendation with Excel is that you always follow one basic rule, which is this. Anytime you create a spreadsheet, do it with the thought that you are not going to be the person who is the end user. Go into it with the idea that someone else is going to be the end user other than you. And the reason we do that is because we want to make sure to design it in a way that it will make sense to someone else. If we design it in a way that only makes sense to us, your way of thinking may be very, very different than someone else's. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong, it's just different. We want to do it in a way that's going to be universally acceptable and understandable by others. So start off with that in mind and think about it from the standpoint that if someone else were to look at this, not knowing anything about it, would it make sense to them? So we'll start off by laying out the labels. To me, this looks like something that would most likely make sense to someone. I'm going to add a little background here to this Girl Scout cookie sales title. And using things like color and background colors and font colors can really go a long way to helping to make a spreadsheet visually understandable by someone else. So I'm going to go ahead and start by clicking on my title. Now this is that merge cell. It's A, B, and C1 all put together. Technically it's called A1. That was our starting point. Now to give it a background color, I'm going to use the little paint bucket up here. So if you go up to your toolbar, or ribbon bar under the Home tab, you'll see the little paint bucket. And here we can go ahead and select a color. I'm going to give it this gold accent color. And maybe going better, and I'll give it a little bold. So now I have a title that stands out a little bit and won't compete with the other labels in the spreadsheet. All right, now we have that in, and we're ready to add our inputs. And we'll go ahead and use the same values as in our earlier PowerPoint example. So I'm going to assume 10 boxes sold and a price per box of $5. Now, for dealing with formatting like currency, easiest way to do it is to use this drop down here. It used to be you had to kind of drill down and do a whole bunch of mouse clicks to get to the part of the program where you could assign formats. And they've made it a lot easier by taking a lot of the really commonly used formats and putting them on this drop down. So I'm going to click this little drop down here, and I'm going to go down and I'm going to select currency. There's also one there called accounting. I don't particularly like the accounting format because it looks like the currency, but what they do is they left justify the dollar sign. In fact, I'll show you what it looks like. You can see what currency looks like right now. If I switch it to accounting, you can see that the dollar sign is now left justified. Currency to me just always looks better. Now, I mentioned earlier that these two cells in our example are going to be input cells. They're designed to change. They will change on some frequent basis, and we want to be able to recalculate our cookie profits every time they change. So the way we're going to designate that these are input cells that are okay to type over is by changing their font color. Okay, we do that with the font color tool. So we're going to start by selecting C3 and C4 if you haven't already. We'll go up to the ribbon bar, and we're going to click on the font color tool. We're going to click on the little arrow to the right of it, and that's going to give us the color palette. Now with the color palette down, we can go ahead and pick the color blue that we want. And I'm going to go ahead and pick this one. One of the things you may learn about me is I am incredibly colorblind. I'm probably one of the most colorblind people you'll ever meet, so I have to guess quite a bit at color sometimes. Okay, now I have my input cells as blue, okay, which means it's okay to type over those. Once you've done that, we're now ready to create our formula. As you may recall, we always start an Excel formula with an equal sign. So going ahead and starting with our equal sign, the formula logic here will be that we're going to multiply the number of boxes sold by the price per box. We don't really care about the 10 or the 5. We really could care less what those numbers are. What we care about is just strictly the logic at this point. And the logic is whatever the number of boxes sold should always be multiplied by whatever the price per box is. Well, the number of boxes sold is in C3. The price per box is in C4. So we're going to multiply C3 times C4. Now, we're not going to type it in, though. This is one of those little shortcuts that I have found in Excel that I think is really a much better way to do this. If I type C3 times C4, it'll work just fine, but there are a couple of issues with it when you're doing this in a real-world environment. One possibility is maybe the cells that are going into your formula are not visible on the spreadsheet. Maybe they're way down, like around row 1000 or column X, but someplace where you can't see right now. Or maybe you mistype it. You transpose the numbers or something. You make a mistake, so you're referring to the wrong cell. What I like to do instead of typing in the cell addresses is I like to point and click my way through it. And what I mean by that is instead of typing C3, I can just point and click at C3. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and do that right now. And when you do that, you'll see that C3 appears in your formula now. So you didn't have to type it, you just clicked on it. Okay, now we're ready for our multiplication. And multiplication in any computer program is virtually always an asterisk. So you're going to go ahead and use your asterisk Get your asterisk in there. And now we're ready to multiply by C4, which we can do with just a point and click. So the result is equal sign C3 asterisk C4. Now, as I mentioned before, once you create your formula, or once you're done editing it, whatever it is you happen to be doing, there's exactly one thing that you should do 100% of the time, and that is hit the Enter key. Don't click anywhere in the spreadsheet. Don't do anything like this, because notice that as I do this, I'm not exiting out of the formula. All I'm doing is changing the formula inappropriately. So the one thing you should do once you're done is hit the Enter key. Okay, and that will return your result. Now, if I change any of my inputs, so for example, I suddenly sell 2 more boxes, so now I'm up to 12 boxes, I can type 12 and my cookie profits immediately changes. Okay, this is the idea behind spreadsheet modeling. We don't use numbers and formulas, we only use cell references. If the price per box suddenly increases to $6, we just have to change it there, and the result updates itself automatically. You can change it back down to 5. So I believe that's the current price of a Girl Scout box of cookies. At least that's the last one I bought. So this is the basic idea behind formula construction in Excel. Now, if we wanted to modify this formula, or just look at it, I can click on the formula, and when I do so, up on the top here on the formula bar, you'll see the formula displayed, the contents of that cell displayed. So this is where we can see what is actually contained in that formula bar. And as soon as I do that, it actually displays the formula. I can do this another way. I can also just double click on that cell, on cell C6, and that will display the formula, and then it'll also do this really cool thing here where it'll put these different colored borders around the cells, and then it will use the same colors in the fonts of those cell addresses. So for example, here C3 is in blue, and here's this blue border around C3. So this is a way to help you visualize exactly what the formula is doing. This is very helpful in situations where you have a formula that doesn't seem to be producing the results you want. You're getting a wrong answer, and you can't quite figure out where you went wrong on the logic. The way to troubleshoot that is that you go through and you just start breaking it down piece by piece, and you just start following through the logic to see what went wrong. Okay, well, I'm supposed to be multiplying C3 times C4. What's actually in C3? Okay, there's a 12. C4 has a 5 in it. You should be able to pull out a calculator, do it by hand, and get the same result. So this is something we use for troubleshooting. If you're in a formula and you want to exit out without making any changes, let's say we made some inappropriate changes and we want to just get out of there without committing those changes, you can use the escape key on your keyboard. Okay, and on about 99% of the keyboards I've ever seen, the escape key is in the upper left-hand corner of the keyboard. That will allow you to exit out of it without actually making any changes. Okay, finally, we're going to go ahead and rename our sheet 2, which is where our Girl Scout cookies are located. And we'll do this by right-clicking on sheet 2, selecting rename, and I'm just going to go ahead and type in Girl Scout cookies. Hit enter when you're done, and you now have your new sheet. We can switch back and forth between the sheets with just a mouse click. So as we go through, we'll be adding additional sheets to this workbook. Okay, this gets us through our introduction to formula construction and spreadsheet layout and navigation. Now, at this point, you're going to want to save your spreadsheet. And you can save this any place you'd like. where you'll be able to get to it again. And you can go ahead and give it a name that you're going to remember. It doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as it's something that you'll be able to get back to again. And once you save it, you're all set. Okay, in the next lecture, we're going to continue with this exact same workbook, and we will be adding another model to it, and this one will be a bit more complex, and we'll start working with multiple formulas that are interrelated to one another. So with each one of these, we're going to be adding more and more complexity to the process. Okay, that's it for now, and make sure to look for the next video as soon as it is available.